Good evening, and welcome to the October 22nd Bloomington Planning Commission meeting. The Planning Commission advises the City Council on development proposals, development standards, long-range planning, and transportation issues. Some items, the Planning Commission has the final decision authority. Others, the City Council will make decisions. Tonight, both the first two items will be moved forward to the City Council after recommendations, and the third, we will hear on issue of a continuance. Tonight, there's a total of 3 items. The fourth item is a study item, which means it will not be televised, but it is public. Before we start tonight, let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Mr. Markegard, do you want to give us the rundown on how this will work in our remote setting tonight?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. Tonight is our 13th remote meeting since the start of the pandemic. We have just 2 people here in the council chambers, and all of the commissioners and applicants and members of the public will be joining remotely. And you can call in at any time if you'd like to testify and receive instructions on how to do that. The number to call is 952-563-8926. And if you prefer to email, it's planning@bloomingtonmn.gov. And that information will be scrolling across the bottom of the screen on the cablecast throughout the meeting.
All right, thank you, Mr. Markegard. And again, for those not familiar with how the public process works during the Planning Commission opens the hearing and the staff will give a report on the item. After the staff report, the public and the applicant may speak. Those will be called upon, first the applicant and then the public. If there's a large number of people that would like to speak to an item, they will be asked to limit their time so that all people can participate in the event. At the conclusion, if there's additional that they would like to talk to, they can come back up to or call in. All questions should be directed to the chair, and then after the public's had a chance to speak, the public hearing will be closed and the Planning Commission will deliberate on the application and make a decision or recommendation. And that's pretty much how the process works. So tonight, let's start with our first item, CUP and final site and building plans for Verizon Wireless. And Mr. Johnson, can we have the staff report?
You would think I would get better at this with as many as we've done. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that. I was muted again. I will share my screen. Does everything look good on your end?
Looks good.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again. This application, as you said, is a CUP, a Conditional Use Permit, and a Final Site and Building Plans. It's for a 30-foot tower. The subject property is 10801 Bush Lake Road. It's the Verizon Wireless data facility right at the intersection of Bush Lake Road and West Old Shakopee. So you can, here is a location map or a site map showing you the subject property as well as the surrounding uses. So this is an industrial area. You do have some residential uses to the southwest, townhome development, as well as single family residential on the other side of West Old Shakopee Road. Other than that, mostly industrial uses to the east and south. There is a auto care center across the street to the west as well. I believe you had an application at your last Planning Commission meeting at this site, so you're probably fairly familiar with this location. So in terms of the specifics of this request, it is not related to the building expansion that you reviewed at your prior meeting. This is the same site, but it's two different working groups who have operations here at this facility by Verizon Wireless. And so what they're proposing to construct or to install on this site is a 30-foot tower, which would host 7 small cell antennas and other associated equipment like radios and cables and other things, as part of a wireless antenna testing network. You'll often hear these facilities referred to as small cell wireless. So these are smaller antennas with more limited range, as opposed to the macro cell antennas that you see on very tall towers, yeah, throughout the community or elsewhere, in order to provide a wireless network. So the approximate location that they want to erect this tower would be over here along the east on the east side of the facility, on the east side of the drive aisle, across from their loading dock area. And this would be a ballasted tower. We'll get into what that means as well. Um, yeah, again, not related to the expansion project and part of a testing network. The only other thing I'll mention on this slide is that they have gotten approval for other antennas to be deployed on site. That is an administrative approval per our ordinance. They have to meet certain performance standards. But if you saw in the staff report, they recently got approval to deploy some antennas. Those antennas are also part of this this testing network. So it's really a research and development component. We've gotten some questions about radio frequency emissions and other aspects of wireless technology, and I want to, we don't do this very often. We don't get into these kind of more federal regulations, but just as a reminder to the Planning Commission and for the benefit of the public, wireless technology and radio frequency emissions are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And the governing act, or similar to an ordinance, would be the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what this act does is it regulates the range and intensity of radio frequency emissions, but it also limits state and local authority with respect to regulating radio frequency emissions, so long as the emissions being generated are compliant with the FCC's regulations with respect to that. So on the screen, what I put there for you in the highlighted, I've distributed the Federal Telecommunications Act to different parties over the last few days, but I sent you a copy as well. But this is the section of the act that applies to this limitation on local and state authorities with respect to radio frequency emissions. So it states that the state or locals can't regulate the installation or placement of these facilities on the basis of environmental effects of radio frequency emissions. So I just want to highlight that because I think it's important to understand what the city's role is versus what the Fed's role is when it comes to these types of facilities. What the city does review is certainly the supporting tower is subject to performance standards within the zoning code. And as you'll see in this case, there is a conditional use permit requirement because these facilities are conditional uses in the base zoning district of this site. So I'll discuss that now. And the purposes of our city regulations really regulate height, appearance, other elements of the facility that don't pertain to the specific emissions that come from antennas. So from a land use perspective, I believe most of you or many of you were on the Planning Commission when we previously processed and reviewed some small cell facilities elsewhere in the community. We processed a couple of those applications, and if you recall, we made some changes to city codes that removed the conditional use permit requirements on some of those facilities. And it may be confusing in terms of, okay, we did that, we made some ordinance changes, why are we seeing this application now? Those ordinance changes were derived or stemmed from changes to state law in 2017 that made the deployment of small cell wireless facilities in public right-of-way a permitted use. And so if you recall those other facilities that we've reviewed in the past, those were within public right-of-way. This is on private property. And the approvals, particularly the conditional use permit, is specifically focused on the tower. And so towers on outside of the public right of way are a conditional use. And again, we want to limit the deployment of those, and we'll get into the reasons why with our co-location analysis. But towers on new towers on sites that are zoned industrial, in this case, industrial park IP, require a conditional use permit. Per our zoning code, support structures that are taller than 15 feet are defined or designated as a tower. So all these support structures on private lands that be taller than that would be a conditional use. Just as a point of clarification or for the benefit of the Planning Commission, if they were able to co-locate these antennas and equipment on a light pole on site and still comply with our light pole standards, they would not have had to get a conditional use permit. They would have not had to erect this tower because that would be considered a co-location. So just from a kind of educational standpoint and understanding the nuances of these ordinances and processes, if they were able to do that, then they wouldn't be going through this process. The reason they're going through this process is because the equipment that they want to host is too substantial to be hosted by a light pole. We'll talk more about that in the co-location as well. Getting to the site plan itself, I pointed out the location where they're proposing to do this. Again, you see the ballasted tower. If you can see my cursor, it's on the east side of the facility, as I mentioned, on the eastern side of the drive aisle. What we're really looking at with the site plan is making sure that the tower meets all the minimum setback requirements in city code, and it greatly exceeds all the required setbacks, so it's very far away from public rights of way. The other thing we're looking at is that to ensure that they're maintaining a clear drive aisle or fire lane so that emergency vehicles can circulate around this site, that there's no no blockages or anything that would impede access. Another issue that came up in the review pertains to a private water main on site. Previously, these plans did not detail the location of the water main, but Verizon did provide updated plans. So I believe those conflicts have been resolved, but just to put a note on it that the final plan prior to the issuance of any permits would need to be approved by the Utilities Division to ensure that that water main is protected. I think that is all I wanted to mention from a site plan perspective. Last thing is there is a restriction on towers in between public streets and buildings. However, there is an exemption for that when the tower is in between a building and a street that serves industrial development. So internal streets that are internal to industrial areas are exempt from that tower locational standard in between a building and a street. So just to keep a point on that. Getting to the plans themselves, the tower is again 30 feet tall, which in comparison to other towers in the community is much shorter tower. It's made out of galvanized steel, so that's a very common material for this type of facility. And so it would be light gray in color, consistent with that with the steel material. So there's 7 small cell antennas that they're proposed to erect, and again, that's because of this testing network. They're testing different types of antennas at different frequencies. If this was a typical small cell antenna, what you'd likely see is just 2 or 3, or maybe even less antennas with a more focused direction in order to boost wireless service. But again, because of the testing aspect, there's more. And again, that's also why it cannot be hosted on a light pole, is just the amount of equipment that is being deployed here. It does have a ballasted design, so typically one of these towers would have a very deep footing and need to be anchored for wind load and just making it structurally sound. This has a different type of design where they ballast or they counterweight the tower. They do screw the plates into the ground, but they're basically counter balanced with a significant amount of weight, concrete blocks, and other kind of binding equipment that kind of binds it all together. So just a point on that. Verizon Wireless did provide some photo simulations of this proposed facility. They gave you 3 viewpoints, one from the north. It's very difficult to see this tower directly from the northeast, as well as directly from the east. We have gotten inquiries from the southwest, from folks in the townhome development who are concerned about the appearance of the tower. Just from staff's perspective and looking at that, I think it's going to be very difficult to see a significant portion of the tower. Again, at a 30-foot height, it's behind the building, and there's a fair amount of landscaping along Bush Lake Road on the west side of this facility. So that's quite a ways away, but certainly from the east, the tower is visible. That's certainly no, or certainly true there. But again, this is a much lower tower than what you typically see with macro cell antennas. So the visual impact is less than typical. So one of the ways that, again, one of the things we can regulate in city code as opposed to the FCC, what their roles and responsibilities are is the city of Bloomington many years ago adopted co-location requirements for towers. And the reason being is that what we don't want to have happen is that each provider erect their own individual tower for each, wireless facility that they want to erect in town. You would have just many more numerous amounts of towers around if we did not have these co-location requirements. And so what it specifies is that towers above a certain height cannot be located next to or close to other towers of similar height. And so it has standards for 120-foot towers, 100-foot towers, and 80-foot and below. This one falls under the category of 80 feet and below. And so as you can see here on this map, we did do some analysis of surrounding towers and wireless facilities. There are some antennas on light poles at Dred Scott Park, which are certainly taller. That's over half a mile away. There is a private tower at 10701 Hampshire to the northeast, which is also a half a mile away. And so another thing so there's no towers close by here to the Verizon wireless facility in terms of the 1/4 mile test for the height of this tower. In addition to that, the ordinance lays out several tests that the facility must meet in order to be considered by the city council and approved. And so this facility, in staff's judgment, meets 3 out of those 4 tests. First of all, the amount of equipment that they're proposing would exceed the structural capacity for a light pole. So again, you could co-locate on a light pole, excuse me, if it was a smaller facility. There is no suitable host sites or towers nearby. I spoke about nearby towers in the area, but you theoretically could install antennas on a taller building as well, but there's not actually any buildings nearby that are of the height and proximity that would make them good candidates either. And then in addition to that, as Verizon has noted, this testing network is not to serve cellular customers in the area. It is more of a research and development purpose as a testing network in terms of testing different small cell antennas at different frequencies with one another. And so based on these activities, they have to have this equipment on site with it being secure, and B rather, that they have access to it for routine tests, because they have to modify the equipment in order to perform different tests. So in staff's judgment and looking at the city code, and that's part of the conditional use permit review, is does this meet the co-location requirements? This does meet the co-location requirements. Last thing I'll say about that is that towers above a certain height have to be able to host other providers' antennas. This does not meet that criteria. It's not a tall tower, so they don't have to host other antennas from other providers on this tower. Some additional information, again, I stated once before, but just to reiterate to the public, this project is not related to the building expansion. To the north, certainly, this is all one site and one facility, so you can take that into consideration, but it's not a chicken or the egg, or a but for this project, they can't do the other thing. It's literally 2 separate groups at Verizon working on these projects. Just to note, the Verizon did submit a compliance letter with respect to the antennas that they're deploying, that they do comply with the FCC's emission requirements. So they are on the record on that. And then just a final procedural point. Typically, these applications, land use applications, have a 60-day and then 120-day shot clock for a decision. This particular case, because this is a small cell wireless facility, there are some federal regulations that also are in play. And those federal regulations would limit the city decision-making process to 90 days. So in terms of action deadlines, the city would not have the ability to extend beyond 90 days in this case based on that federal ruling. We have received 5 emails for this case. All of them oppose the proposed tower. They list 3 main reasons, one being the health impacts of 5G and other small cell antenna technology, again, related to radio emissions. Something that the city does not have the authority to regulate, but nonetheless understand that there. And then the aesthetic appearance of a tower. Some people object to that as well. And in terms of, again, following off from the facility expansion on your other case, as well as just overall, I think in the judgment of some neighbors, just overuse at this site. They certainly did not want to add to that. So that's kind of an overview of the comments that I've seen. Hopefully you all received those and had the ability to review them. Staff is recommending approval of this conditional use permit and final site and building plans. We do have 2 recommended motions. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Just a quick question for you. I wanted to clarify. You mentioned about light pole on site. Was it not needing a CUP if they were able to locate this on site, or was it within the right of way? Trying to understand that.
Chairman Solberg, thanks for that question. If they were able to host this equipment on a replacement light pole on site, they would not need a CUP, because in effect you would not be erecting a new tower. It wouldn't be a new support structure. So when you're replacing one for one on a light pole, that's considered a co-location.
All right, thank you very much. Commissioner Goldsman, you have a question?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, I have a question for Mr. Johnson around this ballasted design of the tower. So one of the things I see in this picture is the location of where this tower is in proximity to, the drive aisle. What concerns does staff have, if any, of protecting that tower from cars backing in and out, or even in the drive aisle? It looks like it's kind of a pinch point for traffic. So just looking at, safety of somebody hitting that tower or accidentally, bumping into it.
Yeah, Chairman Solberg, Commissioner Goldsman, thanks for that question. So the main interest of the city is that access is maintained. That's the key thing. So the location of it does maintain a minimum fire lane of 20 feet, and it does provide adequate ingress and egress to the parking stalls that are kind of in that area. In terms of, it being a pinch point or potential damage to vehicles, those ballasts are significant both in their weight and structural strength, I guess I would say. I can't say for sure what would happen if a vehicle were to hit one of those pads where the ballast is. Julie Plant, who represents the applicant, might have a better idea. But certainly, the damage, if it's to be done, is going to be on themselves. And so it might be worth looking at some bollards or things along those lines. But they do have this type equipment, they're called cow systems, or kind of mobile antenna systems and other things on site. So I think that they park other vehicles in that area. So I don't think it'll be an issue of surprise to the employees who frequent this facility or work here. But
okay, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Johnson, I'm going to go back to one of your early comments, and I just need some clarification because maybe I just didn't understand fully. You mentioned additional structures on site interacting with this 30-foot tower. Is that correct, or was I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, you're correct, Commissioner Albrecht. There's other antennas that are building mounted. So when antennas get mounted on a building, that's an administrative zoning approval process in the city. There's antennas mounted on buildings all over the city, as opposed, and the city does not allow roof-mounted antennas. What our code requires is that you mount it on the facade of a building, and that it not extend above the roof line, and that these antennas be painted to match whatever building they're on. So that's just from a just getting that word out there of how those regulations work. But yes, they got approval to install antennas on the building facade of this. If you can see my cursor, this building in the southeast corner of the site. And so there's going to be antennas mounted on the wall, again, not extending above the roof, that'll be on that building. And those antennas work in conjunction between the antennas proposed to be hosted on the tower. And that's how they're creating this testing network. Julie Plant, again, the applicant's representative, might have more information, be able to explain it better than I. But you're correct that other antennas would be deployed on site. They would just be mounted on a building wall.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions for staff? All right. Not seeing any. Julie Plant, would you like to address the issues?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the Planning Commission. As you mentioned, my name is Julie Plant. I represent Verizon Wireless on antenna project, and I'm here tonight to answer any questions you might have regarding the antenna tower conditional use permit. Nick Johnson did prepare a detailed description of our request. We find it to be very accurate. I did review the staff report with the Verizon team, and all agree to comply with the condition of approval that Nick Johnson presented in the staff letter and the conditional use permit for the recommendation for the Planning Commission. As the application states, Verizon is proposing to install a 30-foot ballasted pole for small cell testing antennas and radios. And as mentioned briefly by Mr. Johnson, the intent of the testing antennas will be to transmit and receive only to the antennas located on the facility property. So it will go from the pole that's being presented here this evening to the facade-mounted antennas on that existing building. There is no anticipated benefit to cellular customers in the area. And I do want to make a point that this proposed installation will not generate any noise, and the base equipment for this project is located interior. Commissioner Goltzman had asked a question about damage to vehicles or any precautionary measures we might take for that area, and I needed a clarification. Was she worried about damage to a vehicle, or was she worried about something happening to the tower?
Commissioner Goltzman, you want to clarify?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so my question was really kind of both. Thinking about the cars or a type of equipment, but then also, if somebody would hit that tower and let's just say it would fall into that retaining pond or onto the property. I was just thinking, how would you protect that from any damage?
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Commissioner. To answer the question, the car would get quite a bit of damage if a car backed into it. Because of the ballast, they're typically cinder block style, very large. They're taller than perhaps what you could imagine right now. But if somebody did back into it, there would be damage to the vehicle. it would take such grand force of any vehicle to run into the cinder blocks to even move that tower slightly. So there is not a concern from Verizon that something would happen to that tower. And part of the structural analysis that is submitted with our application and the building permit does address that to a degree, and hopefully to the satisfaction of the city and the inspections department. So to that end, we do not plan, there's two reasons we don't plan to put any ballasts around this one. It would create an additional hindrance for the drive area, and we wanted to be very cognizant about making sure that any emergency vehicles would have the proper amount of space to ingress and egress from that area. So ballast would actually further impede on that drive area. So we didn't want to put the ballast, any bollards there, excuse me. We didn't want to put any bollards there. Outside of that, this particular area of the parking lot is only for Verizon employees and typically the cell techs, the tech engineers and their trucks and the vehicles. And it's also storage for some of our, as Mr. Johnson mentioned, our cow facilities, our cell on wheel facilities. So anybody who is regularly back there will know that this ballasted tower is there, and so they would be mindful of it. So in this particular area, it's a private area, it's gated, and so public is not able to go back there or guests visiting the facility. That was a very long answer to your question, so I'm sorry about that. But if you have further question or need further clarification, I'd be happy to answer. Outside of that, I will take any questions that anybody has, any of the commissioners.
All right, Julie Plant, this is John Solberg again, the chair. Just one other question, because it looked like there was a bit of a discrepancy, and I want to make sure that we fully understand. If we can go to the next plan document, Mr. Johnson. The ballast looks like there, it's these cinder blocks on these legs, but the picture to the left doesn't necessarily indicate it in relationship to the screening wall. Are those the ballast? Are they shorter? Are they taller? What could we expect out of that?
That is a good, thank you. That is a good question, Mr. Chair. The picture on the right is more indicative to what it will look like when it is actually weighted down. The picture on the left is what it looks like when it is nearly immediately erected. So there's these metal plates that are on the ground, and then on top of those plates will be the ballast, cinder block style weight.
Okay, and are those cinder blocks, as this would indicate, maybe those are only a couple 3 feet tall? Is that correct, or?
That is correct. I don't have the actual plans in front of me to be able to say for sure how many feet or inches it is, but that's more indicative of what the height would be.
Maybe easier way is to say, will it be lower than the screening wall?
Yes, it will be lower than the screening wall.
Okay, thank you. All right, are there any other questions for Julie Plant? Commissioners? Not seeing any. Thank you. We appreciate your comments tonight. And we will move on if there's anybody from the public that has any comments for us tonight. Mr. Markegard?
Mr. Chair, we did not have anybody pre-registered to speak. We have one individual on the call. I'll check in with Ms. Miller and unmute you now to see if you would like to speak.
Yes, thank you very much. Earlier, Mr. Johnson was talking about the antenna and that they would modify the equipment for testing. Can you elaborate on that statement? And this had to do with the antenna for testing, that the equipment could be modified. What does that mean?
Mr. Johnson, are you able to answer Gemma Miller's question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Solberg, Ms. Miller. What I meant by that is that these antennas operate on different frequencies. And so what they can do is they can modify the frequency between two different antennas kind of talking to one another and creating this testing network. So I think what I intended by that is that the frequencies themselves can be varied to kind of test the range and intensity or concentration of that various equipment. If you're looking for a more detailed or technical answer, I would probably defer to Ms. Plant, who is more of an expert in this arena than I.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Julie Plant, would you be able to speak to that issue that Gemma Miller brought up, please?
Sure, Mr. Chair, thank you. Mr. Johnson, you did an eloquent job on explaining or expressing what we're trying to do here. Ms. Miller, thank you for your question. What we're trying to do here is, as the technology changes so rapidly, and we're finding that some of the antennas that we have deployed out in the municipalities for small cell antennas, if they're not working properly, we're not exactly sure why. And so having this arrangement in a facility like this, where right here on Verizon's property, we can test antennas and certain frequency ranges, and we can better assess how we can serve the needs of a municipality and residents and customers by being able to test what frequencies and what antennas work best at a close range. And so the word modify, I don't want that to be misconstrued as we're going to be frequently modifying the antennas on that tower, because that's not accurate. The antennas that we intend to place there are all small cell antennas. They're all relatively small in size. And so we may have to change what frequency they're working on, or change some of our radios in how those are transmitting and receiving. But our intent isn't to consistently modify the antennas that are on the tower.
Thank you, Julie. We appreciate that information. Gemma Miller, do you have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I just have one more question, comment for Julie, and thank you. She talked about changing frequencies. It would always be on the lower end of the spectrum, right? We're talking about very low frequency consistently. Is that true?
Julie Plant, can you answer that, please?
Mr. Chair, thank you for inviting me back. Ms. Miller, I am not a radio frequency engineer, so I am not going to be astute enough to talk about frequencies. And when one is talking about a low range of frequencies versus a high range of frequencies, it's not for me to say.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Johnson, again, this is part of the FCC letter that went from Verizon. Is that correct, that they have to stay within a range that is deemed safe by FCC? Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, they're on the record by submitting a letter from their frequency engineer saying that all of the equipment associated with this tower would operate within the legal range as dictated by FCC. I was speaking with the planning manager about this earlier because I think there's some question on the part of the public of how does some of this equipment get regulated by FCC, and I believe that I believe that there's multiple ways that they do that, but one of the ways in which they do that is they actually test various types of equipment before it gets deployed, and it in effect gets approved by the FCC. And then they used approved equipment. But you're correct that they have a radio frequency engineer specific to this case who is committing to keeping all the equipment within the approved range as dictated by FCC.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. All right, Gemma Miller, does that answer your questions?
It does, and I thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Johnson, and Ms. Plant for that. So I'm fine now.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments tonight. All right, Mr. Markegard, are there any additional people online at this point?
Mr. Chairman, we have no additional people wishing to speak, and I did check with Mr. Pease, and we've received no phone calls on this item either.
All right, thank you. Seeing that there are no additional people speaking in the public meeting tonight, is there a motion by commissioners to close the public hearing? Commissioner Albrecht.
I move to close the public hearing.
All right, we have a motion to close public hearing by Commissioner Albrecht. Commissioner Cookton.
Second.
All right, and we have a second. All right, so we have a motion before us. Close public hearing. All those in favor say aye. By roll call, Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
And Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And I for myself. That's unanimous. The public hearing is now closed. And at this point, I guess we're looking for discussion amongst the Planning Commission members on this application. Is there anybody that has comments at this point? All right, I'll go ahead and maybe start off. I think, a couple things about this. Looking that the tower itself is really what we're regulating. The FCC regulates the radio frequencies. So kind of keeping my thoughts to that, and the fact that even if they would have had a light pole on site, that they could have co-located these facilities. But adding on top of that, that the location does meet the co-location kind of guidance out there for exceeding light pole standards, no other suitable host facilities, and then hearing again from Julie Plant that this is really a R&D for Verizon on these the facility within the facility testing. I am in support of the application and could move that forward. My thoughts, Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with your comments. I have no issues, and I appreciate the actual images of where the tower will be located and what that might look like on site. Very helpful for us as a planning commission to actually understand what that will look like. Based on its location, I think that I can support this moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. Are there other comments from Planning Commission members? If not, I would entertain a motion. Commissioner Goldsman?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll make a motion.
Go ahead.
In case PL 2020-175, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend approval of a conditional use permit for a 30-foot tower at an existing data center located at 10801 Bush Lake Road, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right, we have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Albrecht?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second in front of us. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton?
Aye.
And I for myself. The first recommendation passes. Looking for or will entertain a second motion. Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In case number PL 2020-175, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend approval of final site and building plans for a 30-foot tower at an existing data center located at 10801 Bush Lake Road, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
Thank you. We have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second in front of us for the recommendation of approval for PL 2020175. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman,
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht,
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi,
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon,
Aye.
and aye for myself. Motion passes. So this CUP and final site and building plans will go to the City Council meeting on November 9th, 2020. All right, thank you. Thank you, applicants and public, for talking to that item. Item number 2 tonight is to amend a conditional use permit. And is it Mr. Centenario? You have the staff report for us, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. Item 2 on your agenda is a change of condition, more specifically a change of a previously approved conditional use permit for a dog grooming business that's located within a single family home. City code standards refer to these as home businesses, and this is a type 2 home business, which requires a conditional use permit. This is the property on the screen, 10337 Xerxes Avenue South. This is the location of the dog grooming home business. And when we're thinking about home-based businesses, we have 2 different types. As I mentioned, this was a type 2, and there's certain performance standards that identify whether it's type 1 or type 2. The main thing is a type 1 does not require a conditional use permit and is just permitted by right in city code. And type 2 does require a conditional use permit. And one of the triggers for requiring a conditional use permit is how many employees that do not live inside the home are work at that particular site. And so the applicant did receive approval originally in 2008, and then amended the conditional use permit in 2011, and then is seeking to slightly modify a condition of approval related to hours of operation, and I'll identify the exact change in a moment. So this is what the property looks like from the street. And when we're thinking about home-based businesses, we think about access, folks entering or leaving the property. Could there be some sort of issue if they're dropping off? In this case, if they're dropping off a dog for grooming, is there going to be some sort of constraint or issue with that relative to noise, or just to the mechanics of dropping a dog off? And in this particular case, this property has a nice wide, long driveway, so folks that are using this business aren't going to obstruct the sidewalk, or there's plenty of room for them to drive into the site where they wouldn't need to stop in the driveway apron, therefore causing some sort of congestion on Xerxes. So there's a railroad right of way to the north. So from a noise perspective, obviously a railroad is going to be more impactful than a dog grooming business, most likely. And so we didn't really see anything when we reviewed this change of condition that was cause for concern. This is a home-based business that's been in operation for over a decade. Also, there's always a concern that folks that live around this business would be opposed to any sort of change. And oftentimes when folks get a notice from the city about a home-based business or anything that they're opposed to, that's usually a trigger for them to communicate with the city about some issue that they have. We did get one phone call from a neighbor. There was no opposition. It was more of a curiosity question on what the exact details of the proposal were. So we didn't receive any correspondence in opposition to this business. So the applicant provided a rough sketch of the space. It is in the lower level of the business. There is an egress window, but I think they intended on doing a finished basement, but that became the business space. And so currently, the entire basement, our assessing records identified as 900 square feet, but with mechanical and laundry spaces, it is less than that. So it doesn't occupy a lot of space, frankly, within the home. Going to the exact proposal that the applicant is seeking is related to hours of operation. And so currently, as of the 2011 approval, the dog grooming business is limited to no more than 5 days a week between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. The applicant would like to operate the same number of days, but from 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. So essentially extending the hours of operation 2 hours for those days. We don't really see a concern, especially with work schedules. If dog needs to be dropped off before work, having that extra half an hour in the morning certainly is reasonable. And then if you're picking up your dog at the end of the day, it might be difficult to get there by 4 p.m. So generally, we think that's an acceptable time frame for kind of your day-to-day running errands. And from a noise code perspective, if we're really thinking about kind of what's from a city code perspective, what's daytime, what's nighttime, daytime is 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And so they would operate this business until 5:30 p.m. So well earlier than essentially what we consider nighttime, which generally means quieter operations. So we are recommending approval of the proposed change in condition number 3, and to extend the hours of operation from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m.
All right, thank you, Mr. Centenario. Is there any staff, any questions for staff? Not seeing any. Is the applicant online, Mr. Markegard?
Mr. Chair, the applicant is not on the attendee list.
Okay. Well, at this point, then, is there any public that would like to speak to the application in front of us?
And Mr. Chair, we haven't had anybody register in advance, and nobody is on the list here, but I will check with Mr. Pease.
Okay.
I'll check with Mr. Pease.
No callers.
All right, thank you.
Did you hear that?
We heard
Yeah,
that.
we heard it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Pease. All right. Seeing that there is no one to speak from the public, at this point I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing from Planning Commission members. Commissioner Goldsman.
Motion to close the public hearing.
All right, we have a motion to close the public hearing. Is there a second? Commissioner Cookton.
Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second to close the public hearing. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookton.
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Public hearing is now closed. All right. Any comments from any of the Planning Commission members on this? Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Overall, I think this application is pretty straightforward. The hours of operation seem reasonable. I actually live in the neighborhood and see this home quite regularly. I rarely see any dogs on the property. It's well maintained. It's quiet. And so I think it's a good use of a home business. So all in all, I think it seems pretty straightforward, and I'll be supporting this tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. I used to live near this house as well, and the railroad bothered me more than I've ever heard any dogs from this facility. And as you indicated, it is very well maintained. I think the hours of operation are within any kind of reasonable limit, so I can also support this application. Are there other comments? All right, at this point, not hearing any other. Yes, Commissioner Cookton.
No further comment, Chair. Happy to make a motion.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, in case PL 2020-197, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend approval of amending condition number 3 in case 10783A-08 to expand the hours of operation from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at 10337 Xerxes Avenue South, subject to the conditions attached to the staff report.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookton. We have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman.
I'll make a second.
All right, thank you. We have a motion to approve and a second. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
And Commissioner Cookdon.
Aye.
And I for myself. Motion passes. This conditional use, the amendment for the conditional use permit will move on to the city council meeting on November 9th of this year. All right, item number 3 is a continuation of the Verizon wireless building expansion, major revision, final site and building plans from 2 weeks ago. Let's see, Mr. Centenario, do you have an update?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a bit of an update, and it really relates to the timeline for when the applicant will be prepared to present amendments or revisions to the noise model that they had prepared for the application. Essentially, what they're looking to do is rework or create a more robust noise model to take in consideration a lot of the comments and concerns from the Planning Commission as well as members of the public. They did hear that, and they're doing their best to incorporate that information into the model. The challenge is that this is a fairly complex issue, and so they will not be able to have the adjusted model prepared for a November 5th Planning Commission meeting, or in 2 weeks. Rather, they are very confident that they will be able to resubmit the study in time for a November 19th meeting. And so generally we want them to prepare the best possible study. So having that additional time will benefit everyone, I believe. But the concern was, given a November 19th meeting, are we going to run into some problems with our agency action timeline? The reason we were concerned about that is we already had a resident who identified their intent to appeal. And so we have to plan for that. But thankfully, the Verizon team agreed to extend the agency action timeline by a month to give the city council a little more room to review this proposal should it get to them. So long story short, our recommendation is to continue the item to the November 19th Planning Commission meeting.
All right, thank you, Mr. Centenario. So just to clarify, the only thing we need to do at this point is to make the motion to continue. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
All right, thank you, commissioners. I'd look for a motion. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to continue case PL 2020-166 to the November 19th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting.
All right, we have a motion to continue the case until the November 19th Planning Commission meeting. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And I for myself. The case PL 2020-166 will continue until the November 19th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting, at which point we will reopen the hearing. All right, thank you. So that concludes the Planning Commission meeting for tonight. Immediately following, we will have a study session that will not be televised, but is open to the public to continue to listen in. And with that, we'll conclude the October 22nd regular business meeting.